The legal principles have a crucial role, as they are overriding consideration for the interpretation of specific provisions and fill in legislative gaps when answers cannot be found directly in the wording of the law. The principles are developed through an ongoing process, often through European Court of Justice case law. The relevance of procurement principles can be seen in the judicial review of procurement cases. A large majority of the legal challenges of procurement process or the award refer to breach of one of procurement principles. Recital 1 of the Directive 2014/24/EU expressly states that procurement principles are derived from the treaty principles, more specifically the principles of free movement of goods, services, and establishment, when Article 18 of the Directive elaborates more specifically on the procurement principles themselves. The traditionally recognized procurement principles include equal treatment, non-discrimination, transparency, and proportionality. The 2014 directives in its wording include two new principles. Firstly, the directive states that procurement shall not be designed with an intention to exclude it from the scope of the directive or artificially narrow competition. Secondly, Member States shall take appropriate measures to ensure compliance with environmental, social, and labor law established by EU law, national law, collective agreements, or international provisions. We will refer to these two new principles as the former principle of open competition and the latter as sustainability principle. At this point, it is worth noting that there are varied opinions on whether the two new additions can be truly accounted as procurement principles. Let's take a look briefly on each of the principles and the case law that helped out shape them. First, equal treatment. In the procurement scenario, the equality principle means to be given the same rights. For example, the same access to information and the same opportunities. For example, to amend procurement bids both to tenderers participating in specific procurement procedure, but also the same rights and opportunities to potential tenderers. Therefore, the process cannot be manipulated for the benefit of any supplier, and everyone should be treated equally. By doing so, the principle ensures fair competition for procurement contracts. In the context of public procurement law, the principle of equality has been formulated by the Court of Justice for the first time in a seminal case, Storbelt. In this case, a public buyer or contracting authority, depending how we choose to refer to the public organization, had given one of the economic operators, so the bidders, a chance to put forward a variation to the specification and subsequently treated them in a way that contradicted the instructions that have been set out in the tendering documents. At the time of this particular legal proceedings, the directive did not expressly stipulate an obligation to apply equal treatment in public procurement procedures. Nevertheless, the Court of Justice pointed out that there is a duty to observe that an equality principle lies in the spirit of procurement directives. The equality principle in the procurement law context is closely connected with the principle of non-discrimination. So let's move on to this one. The non-discrimination principle means that public buyer, contracting authority, must not discriminate against non-national bidders versus the domestic bidders in the procurement process. The non-discrimination principle was violated in the before-mentioned Storbelt case, where one of the tender's requirements stipulated local goods and labor use. This term was discriminatory, as it put foreign suppliers, foreign bidders, foreign economic operators, which could not fulfill the national requirement, in a disadvantageous situation, even though they could meet the other output specifications. One of the most frequent violations of non-discrimination principle in procurement law context is the protectionism of national providers. The Court of Justice frequently emphasized, for example, in the Commission versus Ireland case, that the use of specific requirements and standards in the procurement process is condemned if the aim is to discriminate against foreign products or services. So now we had a chance to look at the principle of equal treatment and non-discrimination. The third fundamental principle is a principle of transparency. In the context of public procurement law, it has two functions. Firstly, to eliminate potential discrimination based on nationality, or in other words, to ensure fair contracting. And secondly, to introduce an open competition of the public contracts across the European Union. The tools used in the directive to ensure the realization of these objectives include the requirement that the information on conduct of the tender should be provided beforehand, including applied criteria for selecting bidders and awarding contracts, as well as equal access to the information. In Tele Austria case, Court of Justice confirmed that there is an obligation of transparency by stating, and I quote, "Obligation of transparency, which is imposed on the contracting authority, consists in ensuring, for the benefit of any potential tenderer, a degree of advertising sufficient to enable the service market to be open up to competition and the impartiality of procurement procedures to be reviewed." Now on to proportionality principles, or rather proportionality principle. Requires public buyers to act in a proportionate manner. What that means? That means that measures taken must pass the proportionality test when the action is assessed on whether the measure, firstly, are appropriate to achieve the objective they pursue, and secondly, go beyond what is needed to attain those objectives. Proportionality is particularly a relevant principle from the perspective of administrative burden in procurement procedures, which at times can be considerable. Therefore, the proportionality ensures appropriate balance, as it precludes using a sledgehammer to crack a nut, so to speak. When selecting candidates and tenderers, public buyers should not impose, if those are technical or professional or financial conditions that are excessive and disproportionate to the subject matter of the contract, to the contract aim, so what we're attempting to buy. For example, by requiring unduly high insurance cover or yearly turnover for the candidates to be eligible to take part in the procurement process. In its jurisprudence on public procurement, Court of Justice used the principle of proportionality, particularly in the selection stage of the procedures. Proportionality is highly relevant in procurement in regards to the exclusion grounds in Article 57, but also in regards to contract performance and the contract modification. In Fabricant case, Court of Justice clearly stated that establishing a total prohibition on participation of the parties who had been involved in preparation of the tender was disproportional. And such a provision goes beyond what is necessary to secure transparency and equal treatment within procurement process. Now let's move on to the new, so to speak, two additions, two new principles. Open competition. The basic idea behind this principle is that competition leads to achieving value for money. So the best price and quality that is possible. Consequently, allowing public buyers to get the best for their money. Court of Justice emphasized the importance of ensuring effective competition in relation to public procurement on several occasions, highlighting that opening up competition is the objective of procurement law. For example, in Strong Segurança case, it stated that effective competition constitutes essential objective of the directive. While the importance of competition in public procurement is not questionable, it has been widely debated in the legal literature whether competition in fact is a procurement principle. One of the leading legal scholars in this field, Professor Arrowsmith, argues that competition, and I quote, appears to be simply a manifestation of the more general equal treatment principle, as designing any aspect of procurement for this reason rather than based on other needs and preferences in the project would clearly infringe that principle. On the other hand side, other leading researcher in the field, Professor Sanchez-Girals, argues that the principle of competition has always been fundamental to the regulation of public procurement in the European community, in the EU, and constitutes one of the basic tenets. Court of Justice has ruled in several cases that it is contrary to the principles to restrict competition unreasonably. And that can be a Citur case or Michanecki case or others. However, whether open competition is the aim of public procurement or also it's a principle is not fully clear. The last of the principles, and also the one that raises the most questions, but at the same time is so important for our progress in upcoming decades. Article 18.2, which is a new addition to procurement principles, and it states the following. The member state shall take appropriate measures to ensure that in the performance of public contracts, economic operators comply with applicable obligation in the fields of environmental, social, and labor law established by union law, national law, collective agreements, or by the international environmental, social, and labor law provisions listed in Annex 10. The inclusion of Article 18.2 in the directive is viewed as a milestone in achieving sustainable market of public contract, emphasizing that polluting and social dumping should not be rewarded. However, the provision raises several question marks, and similarly to open competition, there are varied opinions on whether this is a truly principle. Mainly, the binding character of the provision, or rather, I should say, the legal consequence of this provision, are unclear, as Article 18.2 creates somewhat generic duty, as it is addressed to member states rather than to contracting authorities, and thus its obligatory character is somehow watered down, creating a challenge of potentially limited enforceability. Nevertheless, when the Court of Justice had a chance for the first time to comment on the nature of Article 18.2 in the Tim case, it actually confirmed that the purpose of including sustainability in Article 18, which is on principles, was that, and I quote, the union legislator sought to establish that requirement as a principle, like other principles referred to in paragraph 1 of the Article 18. Referring to the fact that Article 18.2 is a cardinal value and that member states must ensure compliance, introduce strong language, suggesting a more principle-like application of Article 18.2 as it has been believed before this judgment. or at least the Code of Justice opens the door for such an interpretation. Article 18.2 lists as sources of the applicable obligations. These include the national and EU law and international laws that are referred in before mentioned Annex 10. The Annex 10 includes the core ILO conventions, for example, on abolition of forced labor, discrimination, employment and occupation, or equal remuneration. Besides, Annex 10 refers also to environmental law obligation in conventions on protecting the ozone layer, hazardous waste and disposal, on persistent organic pollutions and hazardous chemicals and pesticides. While Article 18.2 states that the appropriate measures should be applied to ensure compliance and performance of public contracts, clarification is given in Recital 40 of the directive. The recital indicates that the relevant control should be performed at the procurement procedures pertinent stages. At the selection stage, when contracting authority is considering the exclusion grounds at the award stage, and when applying the provisions concerning abnormally low tender or even the subcontracting.